Wesley Gaines has spent more than 2 decades of his life sitting on the judge's bench, sometimes cold, sometimes compassionate, but always just. He believes in the law, not because it's perfect, but because it's the best thing man has ever devised to keep order in the midst of chaos. But tonight, as the Mercedes S-Class doors closed behind him with the same soft sound they always made, he had no idea he was about to be the one sitting on the other side. Birmingham, Alabama, a city once bustling, now sparsely populated late at night. The streetlights cast a dull yellow glow, streaking the sidewalks like broken glass. Wesley leaned his head back against the chair, breathing slowly. A long day of a complicated financial fraud trial had left him exhausted. They, executives with their own lawyers, had bent the truth like a steel wire. But in the end, justice had been served. The traffic light ahead slowly changed from green to yellow. Wesley stopped. He tapped his fingers on the wheel, his mind still in the courtroom. Then, red and green lights flashed in the rearview mirror, as fierce as a scream in the night. He frowned. No missed stop signs. No speeding. What the hell was going on? He pulled over, not in a hurry, not in a panic. Followed procedure. Hands on the wheel. Breathing steadily. A sharp, decisive, knock came from the driver's side window. Wesley turned. Intuition was instantly taught. A white female officer. Her blonde hair was tied back so tightly that it almost made her face tense. Her cold eyes held no kindness. She didn't smile, didn't say hello. License and registration. The voice was steel. The name on the tag, C. Doyle. Wesley nodded, trying to keep his composure. He opened the glove compartment slowly. No sudden movements. No room for misunderstanding. He had handled too many cases to know that the slightest mistake could turn into tragedy. He handed her the papers. But instead of examining them, she glanced at them briefly, then her eyes stopped on his face, down to his expensive suit, the Swiss watch on his wrist. "Your car?" she asked, her voice dry. Wesley took a breath. "Yes, officer." "Any problems?" She took a step back, tilted her head. "Do you mind telling me where you got it?" He blinked. The question, both absurd and prejudiced, made his blood run cold. "It's in my name," he said, letting a hint of edge escape his voice for the first time. "And I believe the papers show that." Katherine Doyle pursed her lips. She didn't care about the papers. Never mind the logic. To her, Wesley Gaines, silk tie and leather seat notwithstanding, was still a black man driving a nice car late at night. And that, in her eyes, was a legitimate suspicion. "Get out of the car," she ordered. Wesley sat still, as if he hadn't heard. His eyes were no longer worried, they were filled with suppressed rage. The rage of a man who had believed in the system, now seeing its dirty cracks. "Officer Doyle," he said, each word distinct. "I am Judge Wesley Gaines of the Jefferson County District Court. I suggest you call your superiors to the scene immediately." She smiled faintly, unfazed. "You may be the Pope. I still need you out of the car." For a brief moment, their eyes locked, like two blades testing each other in a case that needed no judge, only power and prejudice. Wesley's fingers tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white. He'd heard it too many times, the suspicious tone, the suspicious look, the suffocating familiarity of situations he'd never willingly placed himself in. "It's mine," he said, his voice low and firm. "The car." He turned to face Officer Doyle. "It's in my name. Insured and registered." She didn't back away. Instead, she raised the radio to her mouth, her voice cold in the night. "I have a possible stolen car here. Request backup." Wesley stared at her, eyes wide, not with fear, but with anger. Anger that choked him. She said the words as if she were describing the weather, as if she hadn't just accused him, indirectly but clearly, of being a criminal. As if that didn't have consequences. There's not a shred of evidence, he said, his voice quiet with control. Officer Doyle remained calm, his gaze coldly professional. If you look at the registration. I showed it to you, Wesley interrupted, but she was already taking a step back, her hand tightening on her holster. Get out of the car, she said, this time without any courtesy. Wesley didn't move. He knew what was happening. And what could happen if he made a mistake? He wouldn't be the next news item. Not a number in a death statistic. Not a name that would flash across a screen for 15 seconds and then be forgotten. I am the legal owner of this car, he repeated, slowly. I cooperated. The papers are in your possession. But before he could say another word, a second pair of headlights appeared at the end of the street, casting a white light over the scene. Backup arrived. The patrol car stopped a few feet from Wesley's Mercedes. Its headlights cast a cold, hard glare on the pavement, like the stares of people who don't trust you from the start. Officer Patrick Harris stepped out, mid-30s, short hair, eyes bright as if he'd just been called to a call he'd been waiting for all shift. Doyle turned to him, briskly, possible stolen vehicle situation. Harris didn't look at the papers still in Doyle's hand. He looked at Wesley. Just Wesley. He took in the expensive suit, the fine watch, the unblinking gaze, and then Harris narrowed his eyes. Not because he doubted the car. But because Wesley didn't look like that car. Wesley saw it. He'd seen that look before. Many times. It was never about the car. Get out, Doyle repeated. This time, her hand wasn't just near the holster, it was almost on the stock. Wesley closed his eyes for a second. He took a deep breath. Officer, he said, his voice unwavering, you have everything. Paperwork. ID, proof. He opened the car door, slowly, each movement as clear as a survival drill. A night wind blew past, cold, but not as cold as the gazes of the two people standing before him. If someone like me, Wesley whispered, almost to himself, has to prove that I have a right to exist here, then justice is a joke. Officer Harris glanced at Doyle. For the first time, there was a hint of hesitation. But what happened next, would be the thing that would test not only Wesley's patience, but also the last shred of faith in what was fair. The moment Doyle saw the car, his suspicious gaze locked on the black man behind the wheel. No reason. No evidence. Prejudice had ruled before Wesley Gaines could even take a breath. Wesley stepped out of the car. Slowly. With purpose. He had spent decades in courtrooms, exposing the wrongdoings of arbitrary police stops, dissecting every excuse, every hint of racism the justice system tried to cover up. He had stood before juries, exposing officers who thought their badges gave them the right to do no wrong. Now he was living out the exact scenario he had argued until he was hoarse. But he was not stupid. His right hand slowly reached for the doorknob, his left hand still exposed on the steering wheel. No sudden movements. No mistaking glances. He knew that every second, every breath he took now could be used as reasonable evidence for an irreversible action. The moment he stepped out, Doyle was on his way. Her hand grabbed his wrist, turning him around roughly. A dry laugh almost escaped Wesley's lips, not from amusement, but from disbelief at the absurdity of the situation. Turn around, she commanded, her voice hollow, but her eyes trembling. He was not under arrest. No crime. No warrant. No stolen license plate. Just a man framed by prejudice. Wesley straightened his shoulders, unflinching. I am Judge Wesley Gaines. I am not resisting. I am asking why you are detaining me. Doyle's jaw clenched, his dark eyes frozen in confusion. She had not anticipated it. Her only reply was, because I said so. Her words exploded like a slap back at her own reason. Wesley looked her straight in the eye, no fear, no anger, just a heavy stillness. The look of a man accustomed to violence wrapped in uniform and rules. He had trained himself all his life to keep his cool. In the courtroom, emotion was the enemy of reason. But here, between the pavement and the blue sky, logic was no longer a shield he could use to protect himself. Harris stepped closer, his face hard, his fingers twitching near his belt. His hand did not touch the gun, but the movement was enough to make Wesley's heart pound harder. "Judgment or no judgment, you are not entitled to special treatment," Harris muttered. "I am not asking for special treatment," Wesley said softly. "I am asking for something basic, humanity." At that moment, Doyle's shoulder radio came on, a request for an update. She hesitated. She knew, there was no good reason. No carjacking. No suspicious activity. Just her and her own judgment. But instead of admitting her mistake, Doyle backed away. "Put your hands behind your back." Wesley didn't move. His heart was pounding so hard it seemed to be ringing in his ears. This was the breaking point. One more step, and things might be irreparable. And then, another noise. A second patrol car pulled up beside it. The door swung open. Sergeant Luis Ramirez. The man stepped out, a steady 50-something. Salt and pepper hair, experienced eyes. He wasn't like Doyle, young and insecure. Not like Harris, hot-headed and wary. Ramirez had seen too much to jump to conclusions. But will he make things better, or push things further? Wesley turned his head. The look wasn't a plea. It was a warning. Of honor. Of consequences. And of a system standing in front of the mirror, looking at itself, and not liking what it saw that he stood there, unnoticed. Watching. Eyes as sharp as scalpels, analyzing the situation. Wesley stood still, almost too still. His posture was erect, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, his eyes following every movement like someone accustomed to being scrutinized. His calm was not passive, it was the cold discipline of someone who knew he was being wronged and was waiting to see who would notice first. Doyle. Doyle was as hard as a rock, her shoulders hunched instinctively, as if she too could feel the tension between reason and panic. Her fingers almost glued to her gun holster, not because she wanted to draw it, but because she didn't know where else to put her hands. Harris was different. He moved like an agitated animal. The gaze never left Wesley, and each breath was a trembling hand near his waist, as if the gun were whispering something in his ear. "What's going on here?" Ramirez's voice rang out, even, but heavy as a punch. It wasn't a question. It was an order. Doyle straightened immediately, her voice quick and uncontrolled. "Possible stolen vehicle. Driver refuses to comply." Ramirez didn't move. Only his brow furrowed, as if he were solving a math problem he knew was wrong from the start. "Driver," he repeated, slowly. Then, a thought struck. He turned to Doyle and looked down at the ID in her hand. And in that moment, Ramirez's entire body language changed. He blinked. His jaw clenched. His eyes moved from the card to Wesley. Then from Wesley to Doyle. His voice was low, but each word fell like a blow on stone. "This man is Judge Wesley Gaines." No one spoke. Wesley did not move. Doyle did not either. But her whole body tensed like a rope that had just been pulled to its limit. Harris paused, a flicker of doubt flashed in his eyes, but not enough to overcome the excitement in him. Doyle remained still, but it was clear that control of the situation was slipping from her, and she would not accept it. Ramirez, however, had made up his mind. He cut her off, not with words, but with a slow look and a deliberate shake of his head. Then he turned to Wesley. His voice softened, but it did not lose the weight of the command. "Judge Gaines, are you okay?" Wesley exhaled, a long, thin breath. "Sergeant, I followed all orders. License and registration were issued. Your officer refused to check, instead calling in more people, escalating a situation that should never have happened. Ramirez's nostrils flared, repressed anger. He turned to Doyle, his voice low but urgent. "Have you run the disk drive?" Doyle hesitated. A beat. A blink. And that was enough. Ramirez snatched the registration from her hand, pulled out his radio. "This is Ramirez. Run a check on black Mercedes. Read again, BNK 187. The answer came quickly, as if the system couldn't stand the delay. "No theft reported. Vehicle registered to Wesley Gaines. Information confirmed." The silence now had a shape, a thick, heavy one. Ramirez turned to Doyle. His eyes seemed to bore into the place where her faith was wavering. "You had this information." His voice was cold. His voice was low, but it cut through the darkness like a knife. No one spoke for a few seconds. Doyle's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't bow. Not even a little. "I'm just being cautious," she muttered, her eyes averted, her voice a whisper. "No," Ramirez shot back, quick and sharp as a whip. "You're not being cautious. You're being reckless." The air was thick, as if someone had just shut the door to a cramped room. But Doyle wasn't ready to give up. She'd gone too far to admit she was wrong. "That doesn't mean the judge wasn't acting suspiciously," she said quietly, almost to herself. Wesley stared at her, his gaze piercing. "Suspicious of what?" He let out a slow breath, his shoulders heaving. His fingers curled into fists, then loosened, then clenched again. Ramirez turned to look at him. His eyes met Wesley's, and his face was heavy with something close to regret. "I apologize for this, Judge Gaines," Ramirez said, his voice soft, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "This should never have happened." He glanced at Doyle. "But the damage is done." Doyle stood there, like a cliff, unwavering, unyielding. She still refused to admit her mistake. And that meant the question remained, would she actually face the consequences? Or would the system protect itself? Wesley stood there, jaw clenched, eyes staring into space, as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff. His heart was steady, but heavy. He had spent his life believing in the law. To preserve it. But now he was being judged by it, not as a defender of justice, but as a suspect. Ramirez had made her position clear. Doyle had been wrong. But she did not let go. "I was just doing my job," Doyle insisted, folding her arms, as if to protect herself from attack. Her voice had lost its edge, but her eyes were still proud. She did not back down. "How could I know who he was?" she said softly, almost apologetically. Ramirez stared at her, not taking her eyes off him. "You are not allowed to know who he is." His voice was hoarse and harsh. "You are only allowed to do your job." But Doyle did not look at Wesley. Not once. She had never. Wesley took a breath through her nose, trying to hold on to what little patience she had left. "Officer Doyle, I want to hear it from you," he said, his voice measured and careful, like he was standing on thin ice. "Do you believe you had a valid reason to pull me over?" "No doubt. No prejudice. Just a valid reason." Doyle swallowed. Her throat moved as if she wanted to say something. But nothing came out. Nothing to say. Because the only reason she pulled him over was because. In her head. A black man in an expensive car. Didn't belong there, the streetlights reflected in his eyes, but they couldn't hide what was churning inside, the weight of the truth. It weighed on him like a collapsing building. And she knew it too. Doyle. She stood there, shoulders tense, eyes staring into the distance as if she were still searching for a way out. But there was no way out. There was none. Ramirez took a deep breath, then exhaled. He shook his head slightly, his eyes flickering to Doyle, then back to Wesley, his voice low, almost hoarse. "Judge Gaines. You're free to go." A dry laugh escaped Wesley, a reflex he couldn't control. Free to go. As if he had been imprisoned for a good reason. As if the humiliation could be erased with a nod. Wesley walked to the car, his hand on the door handle. But then, he stopped. Some part of him, the part that had spent decades in the courtroom, wouldn't allow it. He had heard too many excuses for the police, too many mistakes, misunderstandings. But when it happened to him, a black judge, he couldn't turn away. He turned. Standing straight. Eye to eye Doyle. No. Ramirez blinked. Doyle raised his eyebrows, his hands flexed in defense. "I won't let this go," Wesley said, his voice harder than the night wind. "I'm filing a formal complaint. Officer Doyle abused his authority tonight, and I want it on record." Doyle's head whipped toward him, as fast as if she'd been slapped. Her cheeks flushed. "You can't be serious." "I'm the judge," Wesley cocked his head, his eyes as sharp as scalpels. "When I say something, I mean it." A thick silence fell. Ramirez nodded slowly but firmly. "That's your right," he said, his eyes never leaving Doyle. "And you'll have to answer for it." For the first time during the confrontation, Doyle took a half step back. Not much, but enough to see. Something in her eyes began to crack, the confidence, the cold veneer, the belief that her teammates would always protect her. But Ramirez wasn't speaking for her anymore. No one stood between her and the truth. Ramirez pulled out his notebook. His lower jaw clenched, each word hard as stone. "Officer Doyle, I need you to state why you stopped Judge Gaines's car." Doyle's shoulders stiffened. The headlights from another car swept past, casting their shadows against the wall like three people trapped in a play that no one wanted to continue. But the play had reached its climax. And this time, the audience was justice, "I told you." There was suspicious activity. Wesley's voice cut through the air like a cold knife. Ramirez paused. His eyes narrowed, as if trying to peer through a thick fog of lies. Something was wrong. A blink. A hesitant glance from Doyle. She hesitated for only a second. But in that brief moment, Wesley saw it all. The calculation. The struggle to maintain control. A quiet panic, unreasoned, but obvious. Ramirez was the first to break the silence. He said it bluntly, without reserve. "No." Doyle clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "This is ridiculous," she whispered, like a poisonous mist drifting through the air. "Do we really let people like him intimidate us into silence?" Wesley stood still, letting her words sink into his mind like drops of acid. People like him. Ramirez took a step, slow but sure. His face was tense, his features as sharp as if carved from stone. Again, he said softly, almost gently, but there was a storm in his eyes. Doyle paused. She didn't back away, but her eyes had lost their pride. Her mouth tightened, and she said nothing more. Wesley let out a long breath, as if she had given up a beautiful illusion. There, in Doyle's eyes, was no regret. Not even a glimmer of an admission that she had been wrong. She didn't regret what she had done. Only regret, that she had been caught. Ramirez turned to Wesley, his face as dark as a moonless night. "I will make sure this is documented, sir." Wesley nodded, slowly. But it wasn't enough. Just reporting wasn't enough. "I want to talk to your captain, too. Tonight." The words hit Doyle like a punch to the gut. For the first time, panic was evident on her face. Ramirez said nothing more. He reached for the radio. "Get me Captain Emerson. We have an emergency." A beat of silence, then a cold reply. "Roger." Connecting. Doyle could barely breathe. Her chest was heaving, her lips trembling. "Are you really doing this?" she screamed at Wesley. But Wesley's face remained unchanged. Still. Steady. Because if he didn't, who would? This time, the system had to answer for itself. There was no room for excuses. There was no room for silence. The ride home seemed much the same as any other night, same streets, city lights still flashing on the windshield. But Wesley was different. He was no longer the man who had left the courthouse hours earlier. He had believed in justice. In the law. In the idea that if you played by the rules, the system would be on your side. But tonight had proven otherwise. On the way home, he pulled over. Not because of traffic, not because he needed a break. But because everything, had just crashed down on him in a gray wave. Doyle. The name echoed in his mind like the sound of metal on metal. Her brazen arrogance, the way she looked at him, not as a judge, but as someone who dared to challenge the authority she believed she possessed. She didn't apologize. She didn't back down. There was no remorse in her eyes. He gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. The street ahead blurred under the yellow lights, but his mind was elsewhere, on the big question he couldn't shake: what if he wasn't a judge? What if he was an ordinary black man, driving home after work, with no badge, no title, no Sergeant Ramirez there to intervene? So what would happen? Would he be pushed to the curb? Handcuffed in front of his children? Considered a threat simply because of the color of his skin? This isn't just about him. This is about every black man who has ever been stopped, questioned, suspected simply for existing. Who doesn't have the protection of a robe or a business card? Who has been crushed into silence by a system designed to never admit fault? He looked into the rearview mirror. There were no cars behind him. But he still felt watched. Marked. Not by people, but by something larger, a culture, a system of power. Doyle wouldn't change. Not unless there were real consequences. Not until his complaint was more than a piece of paper, but an action. A statement. An explosion in the silence. Tomorrow, he wouldn't just file. He would press. He would demand retraining. He would demand her removal from the area. He would demand transparency, accountability, change. Because if one judge could be treated like this, what did that say about the rest of us? He leaned his head back against the steering wheel, his eyes closing for a moment. The wind blew through the car window, carrying with it the chill of truth. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. And this time, he wasn't standing just as an official. He was standing as a man, a husband, a father, a citizen, demanding justice. If you too believe that this system needs to be held accountable. If you too believe that this story cannot be silenced. Speak up. Share this. Because change only comes when we refuse to be silent.